Hey guys, tonight we're talking about the drug that makes heroin look like aspirin. In 2009, somewhere in the industrial flatlands of Russia's Ural region, a generation of young people discovered something that chemists would later describe as injecting paint thinner directly into human tissue. The drug cost almost nothing. You could make it in your kitchen between breakfast and lunch, and it would begin eating your body alive within weeks, not metaphorically, not gradually, but visibly, from the outside in, like something was digesting you from beneath your own skin. The people who used it didn't look sick. They looked dissolved. Here's the paradox that should make you stop and stare. Krokodil was invented as a painkiller, a legitimate pharmaceutical, medically researched painkiller. Desomorphine was first synthesized in 1932, was found to be 8 to 10 times more potent than morphine, and was quietly shelved because it wore off too fast and caused too much damage. Scientists looked at it, said absolutely not, and moved on. 70 years later, broken, desperate people in Russian industrial cities looked at the same molecule and said, "That'll do." The gap between those two reactions is where this entire story lives. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel if you enjoy these stories. Write in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is. I always find it fascinating to see people from around the world united by one story. Alexei Volkov was born in 1985 in Yekaterinburg, a city that had spent most of the Soviet era producing tanks and weapon systems, and most of the post-Soviet era producing unemployment. His parents were both factory workers, competent, tired, unremarkable in the way that most decent people are unremarkable. His father worked at a metalworking plant that had once employed 12,000 people, and by 2005 employed fewer than 3,000. His mother cleaned offices at night. They weren't poor by Russian standards of the time, but they existed in that particular economic grey zone where nothing was ever quite enough, and nothing ever got better, just different. Alexei finished technical college in 2004 with a certificate in machine operation. He was not a bad student. He was not a particularly good one either. He existed in the broad middle of everything. Middle grades, middle ambitions, middle prospects. He got a job at a manufacturing plant. The kind of work that starts at 6 in the morning and leaves your hands permanently stained with grease, no matter how hard you scrub. He did it without complaint because complaining required energy he didn't have, and because everyone around him was doing the same thing. Yekaterinburg in 2009 was a city under quiet, grinding pressure. The global financial crisis had reached Russia, with enough force to push unemployment to levels the government preferred not to publish accurately. Factories were cutting shifts. Young men with certificates and no connections watched jobs evaporate in real time. The social safety net, already thin after 2 decades of post-Soviet restructuring, had frayed to the point where safety net became a phrase used only ironically. Vodka remained cheap. It was practically a policy decision. Alexei was 23 when the plant cut his shift from full-time to 3 days a week. He was 24 when he met Dmitry Savin. Dmitry was everything Alexei was not, or at least appeared to be. Louder, faster, more connected in the way that certain people are connected, knowing which door to knock on, which name to drop, which problem could be solved with the right phone call. He had grown up 3 streets over from Alexei, but they had never crossed paths as children. They met through a mutual acquaintance at a birthday party in a cramped apartment that smelled of cigarettes and boiled potatoes, and within 2 weeks they were spending most evenings together. Dmitry had a quality that made people feel, temporarily, less trapped. He was magnetic in the specific way of people who have decided that consequences are someone else's problem. The heroin appeared in Alexei's life the way most catastrophic things appear, casually at the edge of an ordinary evening. Dmitry had it. He presented it without drama, the way you might offer someone a cigarette. Just once, he implied. Just to see what it's like. The reasoning felt almost logical in the specific fog of that particular night. The week had been brutal, the money situation was getting worse, and Alexei was tired in a way that sleep no longer fixed. He tried it once. Within 3 weeks, once was no longer a concept that applied. Heroin does something to the brain's reward system that neuroscientists describe carefully and users describe simply. It makes everything else feel like the wrong channel. Food, sleep, conversation, human connection, all of it dims. The drug becomes the only frequency the brain wants to receive. Alexei understood this was happening to him. He could observe it with a strange clinical detachment even as it was occurring. This awareness did not help. Knowing you're drowning and being able to stop drowning are entirely different skills. By spring 2009, both Alexei and Dmitry were dependent, fully, chemically, without negotiation. The habit cost money they didn't have. Heroin in Yekaterinburg arrived from Afghanistan through supply chains that ran through Central Asia, and the price was set accordingly. A gram cost roughly what Alexei made in a full day of work, on the days he still had work. The math was impossible before it even started. Then, in early 2009, the supply began to tighten. Federal law enforcement crackdowns along trafficking routes pushed prices higher and availability lower. A gram that cost a certain amount in January cost 30% more by March. Dealers cut their product more aggressively, stretching supply with substances that made the withdrawal hit faster and harder. Alexei and Dmitry found themselves sick more often, spending more, getting less. The treadmill was accelerating. It was Dmitry who first heard about Krokodil, not as a rumour but as a practical suggestion from someone in their circle who had already made the switch. The pitch was startlingly simple. Codeine pills were sold freely at pharmacies across Russia, no prescription required. The other ingredients, red phosphorus, paint thinner, hydrochloric acid, were household and hardware store items. Total cost per dose, a fraction of what heroin cost. The high was functionally identical, at least at first. The only downside, mentioned almost as an afterthought, was that it destroyed tissue at injection sites. Alexei heard the word downside and understood it abstractly. He didn't understand it as something that would one day apply to his own arm, his own bone, his own reflection in a mirror he would eventually stop looking at. The gap between abstract knowledge and physical reality is one of the most exploited spaces in human psychology, and addiction lives entirely inside that gap. He went to bed that night in his small apartment, withdrawal already starting its slow crawl up his spine, staring at a water stain on the ceiling. The stain had been there since he moved in. He had always meant to report it to the landlord and never had. Outside, Yekaterinburg made its nighttime sounds. Distant traffic, a dog somewhere. The low mechanical hum of a city that ran on industry even when industry was failing. He had a decision to make, except he already knew, somewhere beneath the reasoning, beneath the rationalizations he was already assembling, that it wasn't really a decision at all. It was a direction he was already moving in. The only question was how fast. The answer came the next morning, when Dmitry knocked on his door holding a plastic bag from the pharmacy. The bag contained 45 codeine tablets, a box of matches, and a bottle of paint thinner that Dmitry had transferred into a water bottle, apparently unbothered by the irony. Everything else they needed was already in the apartment. That was the first genuinely disturbing thing about Krokodil, not the drug itself, but how little you had to go out of your way to make it. The ingredients didn't come from a cartel or a chemistry lab. They came from a pharmacy, a hardware store, and a kitchen drawer. Dmitry had watched someone cook it twice before attempting it himself. He moved through the process with the focused calm of a man who had decided that understanding the mechanics made the whole thing more acceptable. The first step was extracting the codeine from the tablets, crushing them, mixing with water, filtering out the binders and fillers that pharmaceutical companies add specifically to make extraction difficult. The industry term for those additives is abuse deterrence. The street-level term is an inconvenience. The codeine solution went into a small pot. Then came the red phosphorus, scraped carefully from the striking strips of matchboxes, a process that took 20 minutes and left both of their fingertips raw. Red phosphorus is the same compound used in safety matches, road flares, and certain pesticides. In the context of a kitchen in Yekaterinburg, it was a reagent in a synthesis that no pharmaceutical company would perform without a fume hood, protective equipment, and a fire suppression system. Dmitri did it next to an open window with a damp rag over his nose. The hydrochloric acid came next. Industrial grade, purchased from a hardware store where it was sold for cleaning concrete and stripping rust. A few milliliters into the mixture. Then the iodine, the same iodine sold in every Russian pharmacy for wound disinfection, added in a precise enough ratio that Dmitri consulted a handwritten note he kept folded in his jacket pocket. Someone had given him that note. Someone had given it to them, and so on. A chain of chemical instructions passed hand to hand across Russian cities, like a recipe for a dish that happened to kill you slowly. The mixture was heated. The smell that rose from the pot was not subtle. A sharp, caustic combination of solvent fumes and something organic burning underneath. It filled the kitchen instantly. Alexei's eyes watered. His throat tightened. He moved to the window and realized the window was already open, which meant this was simply what the process smelled like with ventilation. Without it, the fumes would have been enough to cause chemical burns to the respiratory tract before the drug ever reached a vein. What the heat was doing, chemically, was converting codeine into desomorphine through a reduction reaction. The phosphorus and iodine acted as reducing agents. The process worked. That was the obscene part. It actually worked. A person with no chemistry background, following handwritten instructions in a residential kitchen, could successfully synthesize a Schedule I opioid. The purity was terrible. The consistency was unreliable. The leftover byproducts, residual solvents, phosphorus compounds, heavy metal traces from the iodine, stayed in the solution because nobody was filtering them out with anything more sophisticated than cotton wool, or in some cases a piece of cloth torn from an old shirt. Dmitri used a makeshift filter. Cotton from a cigarette filter stretched across the neck of a bottle. The liquid that passed through was brown, not amber, not golden, brown, the colour of something that had been through a process it shouldn't have survived. It looked like tea made by someone who had never seen tea and was working from a description. It looked frankly like something you would immediately pour down a drain. Instead, Dmitri drew it into a syringe. Alexei watched all of this. His withdrawal was active. That low-grade, full-body wrongness that heroin dependency produces when the drug isn't present, like every nerve in the body filing a complaint simultaneously. His hands were not shaking dramatically. That's a cinematic lie. Real withdrawal shakes are subtle, persistent, exhausting. A fine tremor that makes everything slightly harder than it should be. He watched Dmitri inject the brown liquid and waited. 30 seconds. Dmitri's face changed. Not explosively. Gradually, like a fist unclenching. The tension around his eyes released. His shoulders dropped 2 centimeters. His breathing slowed and deepened. The specific expression that crossed his face was not happiness exactly. It was the cessation of discomfort so complete that the body interprets it as pleasure. That distinction matters enormously, and almost nobody makes it when they're in withdrawal. Alexei took the syringe. His veins were still accessible. This was early enough that the damage hadn't started, that the architecture of his circulatory system was still intact and cooperative. He found the vein in the crook of his elbow, the standard site, the textbook location. He had done this before with heroin. The mechanics were identical. The desomorphine hit faster than heroin, noticeably, measurably faster, because the molecular structure allows it to cross the blood-brain barrier more rapidly than morphine-derived compounds. Within 15 seconds of injection, the withdrawal was gone. Not fading. Gone. Replaced by warmth that started at the chest and moved outward like something spilling. His vision softened at the edges. The kitchen, the chemical smell, the brown water bottle on the counter, Dmitri sitting across from him with his eyes half closed. All of it receded to a comfortable distance. He felt fine. That was the trap, fully sprung. What neither of them felt, because the nervous system prioritizes comfort over alarm, was the paint thinner moving through their bloodstream, or the residual phosphorus compounds, or the traces of industrial solvent that had not been filtered out because the filter was a cigarette. The human body has no immediate alarm system for slow tissue destruction. Pain at an injection site feels, initially, like the ordinary soreness of a needle puncture. The vein's reaction to a caustic substance is indistinguishable at first from the vein's reaction to any injection. The damage begins immediately. The awareness of damage comes weeks later. The high lasted approximately 90 minutes. Heroin, for comparison, lasts 4 to 6 hours. This was the economic and biological trap that Krokodil set with mechanical precision. Shorter duration meant more frequent dosing, which meant more cooking, which meant more exposure to fumes, more injections, more tissue damage, all accelerated by the very fact that the drug wore off faster than what it replaced. Users didn't take Krokodil less often than heroin. They took it more. By the time the warmth faded and the kitchen came back into focus, both of them were already calculating the next cook. Not discussing it, calculating it, internally, the way you calculate whether you have enough time to do something before an appointment. The appointment in this case was withdrawal, and withdrawal was already 3 hours away. Alexei looked at his arm. The injection site was red, slightly raised, the way any injection site looks immediately afterward. He pressed 2 fingers against it and felt ordinary soreness. There was nothing to see yet. No discoloration, no swelling beyond the norm, no sign of what the brown liquid had just introduced to the tissue surrounding that vein. Outside, Yekaterinburg was going about its morning. Someone was selling produce from a truck on the street below. A child was being walked to school. The ordinary machinery of a city operating on the assumption that most of what happens inside apartments is unremarkable. In the kitchen, Dmitri was already consulting the handwritten note again, not because he'd forgotten the process, but because he was thinking about ratios, whether they could extract more desomorphine per tablet, whether a slight adjustment to the phosphorus quantity would increase yield. He was, in the specific way of people who have found a system, optimizing it. This was the second genuinely disturbing thing about Krokodil. It created its own momentum. The short duration forced frequency. The frequency forced skill. The skill created routine. And routine, in the context of addiction, is the closest thing to safety that a person can feel, even when the routine is building a small chemical weapon in a residential kitchen and injecting it directly into a vein twice a day. They cooked again that afternoon. The second batch was slightly more efficient. Dmitri had adjusted the ratios. 3 weeks in, Alexei still believed he had a handle on it. This is not stupidity. It is the standard architecture of addiction, the brain constructing a narrative of control even as control evaporates, the way a pilot might calmly read instruments while the plane descends. Alexei went to work on the days his shift existed. He cooked in the morning before leaving, injected, went to the plant, came home, cooked again. The structure felt almost disciplined. He had a schedule. Schedules feel like evidence of functionality, even when every item on the schedule is oriented around destroying yourself. The apartment's rhythm changed. Dimitri was there most mornings now, arriving before 8 with pharmacy receipts and matchboxes. They had established an unspoken division of labour. Dimitri sourced the codeine tablets, working his way through different pharmacies in rotating sequence to avoid triggering suspicion, while Alexei managed the cooking process with increasing technical competence. He had memorized the note. He no longer needed to consult it. The chemical smell became background. This is one of the most underreported aspects of the Krokodil phenomenon, how quickly the human olfactory system adapts to what would strike any outside visitor as an immediately alarming odour. The apartment smelled of paint thinner, iodine, and something beneath both that was harder to name, something organic and slightly sweet that experienced hospital staff would later recognise immediately. Alexei had stopped smelling it within 2 weeks. His neighbour, an elderly woman named Zinaida who lived directly below, noticed it every time she passed his door. She said nothing. This was a building where people had learned over decades that noticing things about neighbours rarely improved anyone's situation. Alexei lost his factory job in the 5th week, not fired dramatically. His shift was eliminated in a restructuring that affected 14 workers simultaneously. He received a document, a handshake, and 2 weeks of severance pay. The severance lasted 9 days before it was entirely converted into codeine tablets and matchboxes. He told his mother he was between jobs, that something better was coming. She brought him food twice that month, leaving it at his door because he didn't always answer when she knocked. Dimitri knew people. This was his consistent value proposition, a social network that extended into parts of Yekaterinburg's underground economy that Alexei had never navigated. Through Dimitri, 2 new people entered the apartment's orbit within the first month. The first was a man named Ruslan, 31, who had been using various opioids since his early 20s and approached Krokodil with the professional detachment of someone evaluating a new product. The second was Lena. Lena Sorokina was 19 years old when she appeared in the apartment doorway one evening, introduced by Dimitri with the casual brevity he applied to most social transactions. She was small, dark-haired, quiet in the way that some people are quiet because they've learned that speaking costs more than it returns. She had grown up in a suburb of Yekaterinburg, had briefly attended a nursing program before withdrawing, and had been using opioids, heroin mostly, for 8 months before the supply issues forced the same calculation onto her that they had forced onto everyone else. She sat in Alexei's kitchen and watched the cooking process with the focused attention of someone who understood immediately what she was looking at. She became a regular within a week. The apartment now had 4 people cycling through it daily, cooking, injecting, waiting out the short plateau of the high, then counting down to the next cook. The logistics multiplied. More codeine was needed. Dimitri began recruiting additional buyers, people who purchased tablets from pharmacies on behalf of the group, paid in doses. The operation had the organizational structure of a small, terrible business. Ruslan was the first one whose body began visibly reacting. 6 weeks into his Krokodil use, the injection site on his forearm developed a darkness that went beyond bruising. Bruises fade through a spectrum, purple to green to yellow, following the breakdown of hemoglobin. This didn't fade, it deepened, the skin taking on a greyish-green tinge and a texture that was subtly wrong, slightly thickened, like leather left in water too long. He covered it with his sleeve and nobody addressed it directly. This was the group's first encounter with what the drug actually did to tissue, and the collective response was to not look at it directly, the way you don't look directly at something that, once acknowledged, cannot be unacknowledged. Alexei noticed. He noticed and filed it somewhere behind the part of his brain that was tracking withdrawal timelines and codeine supply levels. The human capacity for selective attention is extraordinary. It is in fact one of the brain's most sophisticated functions, allowing people to maintain functional focus by suppressing peripheral data. Addiction weaponizes this function. The peripheral data being suppressed in this case was the fact that Ruslan's arm was dying. The apartment's geography shifted to accommodate the new reality. The kitchen was now primarily a laboratory. The actual cooking space had been reduced to a corner, and the central table was permanently occupied by the materials and equipment of synthesis. Plates and cutlery migrated to a shelf. Nobody cooked food in the kitchen anymore. This was not a conscious decision. It happened the way most things in the apartment happened, gradually, without announcement, until the new arrangement simply was the arrangement. Alexei's mother visited in the 8th week. She'd been calling without answer often enough that she took a bus across the city to check in person. She found her son thinner than she remembered. Not dramatically, not yet, but noticeably. The way you notice that a photograph is slightly out of focus before you can articulate why. She saw the apartment. She couldn't have identified what she was seeing on the kitchen table, but she felt the wrongness of it the way people feel wrongness before they understand it. He told her he was fine. He said he had been sick with something minor. He steered her out within 20 minutes, and she left carrying a feeling she didn't have words for, which is one of the most dangerous emotional states a parent can be in. The injection sites on Alexei's arms were multiplying. The veins at the original sites were becoming unreliable, not collapsed yet, but damaged enough that they didn't always cooperate. He was moving progressively toward less used sites, the way a writer moves across a page. The new sites bruised more aggressively. The tissue was softer there, less accustomed to puncture. Recovery between injections was slower. Then Dmitri pointed at Ruslan's arm one morning and said 3 words that ended the apartment's collective denial. He didn't need to say more. Everyone looked, really looked. What they saw on Ruslan's forearm had progressed beyond the initial discoloration. The skin was now clearly dying, the tissue underneath raised and hard, the border between affected and unaffected skin as distinct as a geographic boundary on a map. The centre of the wound had begun to break down. It smelled. Not strongly yet, but enough that once you knew what you were smelling, you couldn't not smell it. Ruslan left the apartment that afternoon and didn't come back for 2 days. When he returned, the wound was bandaged. He'd visited a clinic, told them he'd burned himself, received antibiotics and wound dressing, and resumed injecting into the other arm before the dressing had time to dry. The clinic had not asked enough questions. Or perhaps they had asked, and he had answered incorrectly. Either way, the documentation of his visit would eventually contribute to a pattern that regional health officials were only beginning to notice, but not yet willing to name. Lena, watching Ruslan's arm, did something that surprised Alexei. She didn't recoil. She studied it with the focused, analytical attention of someone making a calculation, as if she were measuring the distance between where Ruslan was and where she was, and determining whether the gap was survivable. Whatever answer she arrived at, she stayed. She cooked that afternoon with precise, economical movements, and injected with the practiced efficiency she'd developed over weeks. She was 20 years old, and she was very good at something that was killing her. Alexei, watching her, felt something he couldn't name. Not quite guilt, not quite fear. Closer to recognition. The sense that events were moving in a direction that had been determined before any of them arrived at this kitchen, and that the direction was not good, and that he was going to keep moving in it anyway. Outside, it was March. The snow was beginning to soften at the edges. Yekaterinburg streets were returning to visibility after a winter that had buried everything under a grey-white consistency. Spring in the Urals arrives reluctantly, like someone who's been told good news they don't quite believe yet. In the apartment, nobody noticed the season changing. The ulcer appeared on a Tuesday. Alexei noticed it the way you notice a crack in a wall. Not when it forms, but when it has already been there long enough to become undeniable. It was on his left forearm 2 centimeters below the elbow, at a site he'd been using for 3 weeks. The skin around it had first gone dark, that same greyish-green that had appeared on Ruslan's arm, the colour that had no business being on human skin. Then it hardened. Then, one morning, the surface broke open. Not dramatically, not with pain sharp enough to demand attention. It simply opened, the way overworked material eventually gives way, and beneath the surface was tissue that was wet and dark and wrong, in a way that Alexei's body understood before his mind did. He stared at it for a long time without moving. The name Krokodil, crocodile, came directly from this. The skin at injection sites didn't just discolour. It transformed, taking on a scaly, raised, reptilian texture that medical literature would eventually describe as cutaneous necrosis with overlying hyperkeratosis. The street named it faster and more accurately than the journals did. People who saw it knew immediately what they were looking at. People who had it looked at their own arms with a detachment that was not psychological strength, but neurological damage. The drug suppressing the emotional response that the visual information should have triggered. Desomorphine itself was caustic to tissue. But the impurities in street-cooked Krokodil compounded the damage catastrophically. The residual solvents destroyed cell membranes on contact. The phosphorus compounds triggered inflammatory responses that the immune system couldn't resolve because the source of irritation never stopped arriving. The heavy metal traces, iodine byproducts, traces of industrial chemicals, accumulated in tissue and disrupted the biochemical processes that normally keep cells alive. Each injection delivered not just the drug but a small targeted attack on the surrounding tissue. Do it twice a day for 3 months, and the attack becomes a siege. Alexei covered the ulcer with a bandage he found under the bathroom sink. The bandage was too small. He folded it lengthwise, pressed it against the wound, and secured it with a strip of electrical tape because he had no medical tape. This was his entire treatment plan. The concept of going to a doctor existed in his mind as a theoretical option in the same category as quitting, something that existed as a possibility but not as an action he was actually going to take, because taking it would require confronting, in a clinical and documented setting, the complete picture of what he was doing to himself. He told no one in the apartment about the ulcer. This was unnecessary secrecy. Everyone there was developing their own versions of the same problem. But addiction operates on compartmentalization, and each person in that kitchen maintained private accounts of their own deterioration, as if keeping the information internal somehow kept the damage internal too. Lena noticed anyway. She had a medical student's eye for physical detail, the remnant of 8 months in a nursing program, and she tracked the changes in everyone around her with a quiet, compulsive attention she couldn't fully explain. She saw the way Alexei favoured his left arm, the slight stiffness in the elbow, the electrical tape visible below his sleeve when he reached for something. She said nothing. In the apartment's unspoken social contract, noticing and commenting were 2 entirely separate actions, and only the first was permitted. By the end of April, the ulcer had grown, slowly, consistently, without drama, the way serious things often progress, not in dramatic leaps, but in steady increments that are easy to minimize individually and impossible to minimize collectively. The wound was now the size of a large coin, the edges raised and darkened, the center a depression of exposed tissue that produced a thin, persistent discharge. Alexei changed the bandage daily. The old bandages went into a plastic bag he kept under the sink because he had some instinct that they shouldn't go into the regular trash. The bag filled slowly. He never examined its contents. Some forms of evidence are too direct. The smell in the apartment had changed a register. This was not the chemical smell of the cooking process. That was still there, still omnipresent, still something they had all stopped consciously registering. This was something else, layered beneath the solvents like a bass note under a melody. Organic, persistent. The specific odour of tissue that is no longer alive but hasn't fully declared itself dead yet. Medical professionals call it the smell of infection. People who have encountered it in other contexts, battlefield medicine, certain surgical wards, the aftermath of serious accidents, recognize it instantly and find it very difficult to forget. Ruslan's situation had progressed to the point where the original wound on his forearm had developed satellite damage, secondary areas of necrosis appearing around the central ulcer, connected by threads of discoloured tissue beneath the skin surface. The wound was spreading not just outward but inward, following blood vessels and connective tissue pathways deeper into the arm. He had wrapped it himself with gauze purchased from a pharmacy, changing the dressing with the methodical regularity of someone who has decided that management is the same thing as treatment. It was not the same thing. The infection beneath the gauze was working on its own schedule, indifferent to the bandaging. Dimitri's damage was concentrated on his lower leg. He had, weeks earlier, begun injecting into the femoral area, and then the leg when his arm veins became unreliable, a progression that Krokodil users followed with grim consistency as each region of the body became used up. The left shin had developed an abscess that was now visibly raised through his jeans, a hard, hot swelling the size of a closed fist that he walked around with a careful gait of someone navigating terrain they don't entirely trust. He had started sleeping on his back exclusively because any pressure on the leg woke him. Alexei made a single visit to a doctor in the first week of May. The decision came not from clear-headed assessment of his medical situation, but from a moment of panic at 3 a.m. when the wound on his arm had bled through 2 bandages in succession and showed no sign of stopping. He took a bus to a district clinic when it opened at 8, told the intake nurse he had injured his arm in a workplace accident, and sat in a waiting room for 40 minutes among people with ordinary ailments, coughs, a child with an ear infection, an old man with back pain, feeling the specific alienation of someone who knows their problem is not ordinary. The doctor was a man in his late 40s who had been practicing medicine in a district clinic for long enough to recognise the gap between what patients said happened and what actually happened. He looked at the wound for a long time without speaking. He cleaned it, which produced pain sharp enough that Alexei's vision narrowed briefly at the edges. He applied proper dressing. He wrote a referral to a hospital-based wound care specialist and a separate referral to a narcology unit, the Russian medical system's designation for addiction treatment services. He handed both documents to Alexei with the resigned precision of a man who knew which one would be used. Alexei took both documents. He folded them and put them in his jacket pocket. He thanked the doctor with genuine courtesy. He'd been raised with good manners and they persisted even through everything that was eroding around them. He left the clinic, stood on the pavement outside and stood there for a full minute. Then he took the referral to the wound care specialist out of his pocket, looked at it and put it back. He took the narcology referral out and held it longer. A tram passed. A woman walked by with a stroller. He put the narcology referral back in his pocket without tearing it, which felt to him like a form of optimism. He went home. He cooked. He injected into his right arm the other side, giving the left a break that was too short to matter, biologically, but felt like a concession to the doctor's concern. The referrals remained in his jacket pocket for 11 days, until he put the jacket through a wash cycle and they dissolved into grey paper pulp in the drum. What was happening inside his arm, beneath the dressing the doctor had applied, was not waiting for decisions. Necrosis doesn't negotiate. The tissue death was progressing along the path of least resistance, following the vein upward, consuming the cellular infrastructure of the arm the way a fire moves through a building, not randomly but along the load-bearing structures, the pathways that connect everything. The immune system was fighting it. The immune system was losing, and twice a day, Alexei was re-injecting into the same general region, delivering fresh chemical insult to tissue already in crisis. By mid-May, the wound had developed a second satellite site, a smaller darkening 2 centimeters above the original ulcer, connected to it by a ridge of hardened, discolored skin. The 2 wounds were beginning to merge at their edges. Alexei looked at this development one morning with the particular focus of someone finally doing arithmetic they've been avoiding, adding up numbers they already knew. The sum was not good. He pressed his fingers carefully around the border of the wound, feeling the temperature difference between the affected tissue and the healthy skin surrounding it. The infected area was warmer, the dead area cooler, room temperature against his fingertips in a way that living tissue never is. He bandaged it, drank a glass of water, and went back to the kitchen to start the morning cook. Alexei's apartment was not an anomaly. This is the fact that changes the entire scale of the story. While he and Dmitri were running their kitchen on the 4th floor of a residential building in one district of Yekaterinburg, identical operations were running in apartments across the city, across the region, across the entire industrial belt of Russia's Ural and Siberian cities, Chelyabinsk, Novosibirsk, Perm, Omsk, Yekaterinburg itself, a chain of cities that shared the same post-Soviet economic collapse, the same gutted manufacturing sector, the same demographic of young men with technical skills and no legitimate application for them, the same freely available codeine at every corner pharmacy. The geography of Krokodil's spread followed the geography of Russian industrial decline with a precision that no public health researcher could have designed, and no government official wanted to acknowledge. By mid-2009, Russian hospitals in these cities were beginning to receive patients that their staff had never been trained to treat. Not because the wounds were medically unprecedented in the abstract, necrotic tissue, deep infections, bone exposure, but because the volume, the age of the patients, and the speed of deterioration were unlike anything in the clinical literature that Russian medical schools used. A doctor who had trained for 30 years and treated everything from frostbite to industrial accidents would look at a crocodile wound and feel, beneath the professional composure, a specific kind of alarm that comes from encountering something genuinely outside the frame of reference. The wounds arrived in stages. First, the discoloration and hardening. Patients often at this stage didn't seek treatment because the damage looked manageable, and seeking treatment meant disclosing the cause. Then the ulceration. Patients sometimes appeared at this stage with cover stories, workplace accidents, chemical burns, dog bites. Experienced clinicians stopped believing the cover stories within weeks of seeing the first cases because the wound pattern was specific and consistent in a way that accidents aren't. Then the deep necrosis, bone exposure, tendon involvement, infections that had progressed to the point where the choice was surgery or systemic sepsis. Patients at this stage often arrived by ambulance, unconscious or semi-conscious, because they had waited until the body made the decision for them. The Russian government's response in 2009 was charitably described delayed. The Federal Drug Control Service, the FSKN, was focused on interdiction, seizures, arrests, supply chain disruption. Krokodil presented a structural problem that interdiction couldn't address because there was no supply chain to disrupt. The supply chain was every pharmacy in Russia that sold codeine without prescription, every hardware store that sold paint thinner, every supermarket that sold matches. Making Krokodil illegal was straightforward. Making its ingredients illegal was an entirely different legislative challenge, one that required political will that moved considerably slower than the epidemic. Codeine without prescription remained legal in Russia until June 2012. 3 years after the epidemic was clearly visible, clearly documented, and clearly killing people at scale, the tablets that made the whole process possible were still available over the counter at every pharmacy. This was not a secret. Doctors knew. Regional health administrators knew. Journalists were beginning to know. The information existed. It simply hadn't yet accumulated sufficient political weight to overcome the pharmaceutical industry's preference for the status quo and the bureaucratic inertia of a system not designed for rapid response. Meanwhile, the social infrastructure that should have caught people before they reached Krokodil was operating at minimal function. Russia's narcology system, the network of addiction treatment clinics inherited and underfunded from the Soviet era, was stretched, stigmatized, and largely ineffective at treating the kind of dependency that Krokodil created. The standard narcology protocol was detoxification, followed by counseling, followed by an expectation of willpower. This protocol had mediocre outcomes for heroin. For Krokodil, it was nearly useless, because Krokodil addicts arrived not just with chemical dependency, but with bodies that required immediate and sustained surgical intervention, wounds that needed debridement, infections that needed intravenous antibiotics, tissue that needed removal. The narcology system had beds and counsellors. It didn't have surgical teams and wound care specialists in the same building. Alexei encountered this gap directly in May 2009, when he did something that required more effort than his clinic visit. He voluntarily entered a rehabilitation centre. The decision came on a specific morning after a specific event. He had looked at Ruslan's arm in clear morning light and understood with sudden and complete clarity that what was happening to Ruslan's arm was happening to his own at a slightly earlier stage. The trajectory was visible. The endpoint was visible. He packed a bag, told Dmitri he was going, and took a bus to a state-funded rehabilitation facility on the eastern edge of the city. The facility was grey and organised. It had rules, schedules, meals at fixed times, the institutional architecture of a place designed to replace one structure with another. The staff were not unkind. They were overwhelmed and under-resourced, operating with a patient-to-counsellor ratio that made individualised treatment functionally impossible. When Alexei was admitted, the intake nurse examined his arm with a long pause that communicated more than any clinical language could. She had seen this before. She had been seeing it for months. She cleaned and dressed the wound competently, started him on antibiotics, and noted in his file that the wound care would need to continue daily. The withdrawals started 12 hours after his last injection. Krokodil withdrawal is physiologically similar to heroin withdrawal, but empirically reported as more severe, longer duration, more intense physical symptoms, a specific kind of bone pain that survivors consistently describe as feeling like the skeleton itself is trying to escape the body. Alexei lay in a facility bed and experienced all of it without the ability to stop it. The medical staff gave him what they had: symptomatic treatment, fluids, mild sedation that took the edge off without touching the core of the experience. He was conscious for most of it. He was aware of every hour. He lasted 4 days. Not because he was weak. This framing is both inaccurate and pointless. He left because the combination of withdrawal pain, wound pain, and the facility's inability to adequately address either had created a situation his damaged brain processed as unsustainable. The calculus was brutally simple. He knew exactly what would make everything stop, and it was 90 minutes away by bus. The rehabilitation centre's protocol had no mechanism to prevent a voluntary patient from leaving. He signed a form, collected his bag, and walked to the bus stop. The city looked the same as it had 4 days earlier. Same streets, same buildings, same May light on concrete. Everything outside was unchanged. The only thing that had moved was Alexei, backward, to a position slightly worse than where he'd started, because the 4 days of abstinence had reduced his tolerance enough that the first injection back hit harder than expected, which the brain's reward system filed immediately as evidence that breaks were worth taking. A perverse incentive, a trap inside a trap. Back in the apartment, the group had changed configuration in his absence. Ruslan was gone, not dramatically, not with announcement, simply absent in the way that people sometimes exit situations when the situation has progressed, beyond what they're willing to witness in others, even when they're experiencing the same thing themselves. His spot at the kitchen table had been taken, informally, by a new person Dmitri had introduced, a man of about 30 whose name Alexei learned but immediately forgot, which was becoming a feature of his cognition rather than an exception. Dmitri showed Alexei something that evening. Not a wound, something on his phone. A photograph passed through their network taken by someone who knew someone in Chelyabinsk. It showed a hospital ward. The photograph was not graphic in the way that combat photography is graphic. No blood, no visible trauma. But the image of the ward, the number of young patients, the arrangement of bandaged limbs, the specific posture of people in the beds that communicated a degree of damage beyond what the bandages covered, was its own kind of document. Someone was taking pictures. Someone was starting to pay attention to what was happening in these cities. Alexei looked at the photograph for a long time. Then he handed the phone back and went to check on the wound on his arm. The antibiotics from the facility had made a small difference. The infection was slightly less aggressive. The redness around the wound's border marginally reduced. The wound itself was the same size. Tissue doesn't regenerate while the source of damage continues to arrive twice daily. Biology is not a moral system. It doesn't reward effort or punish bad decisions. It simply processes inputs and produces outputs, and the outputs, in Alexei's arm, were proceeding exactly as the chemistry required. Outside, a Russian spring evening was doing what Russian spring evenings do, cooling rapidly after a warm afternoon, the light going golden and then grey in the space of an hour. Somewhere in the city, a doctor was finishing a shift and writing notes about a patient whose wounds she couldn't explain to her own satisfaction. Somewhere else, a pharmacist was selling codeine tablets to a young man who bought them every 3 days and never had a prescription. The connections between these events were real and direct, but no single person in the chain was positioned to see all of them simultaneously. The epidemic was running on its own momentum now, city by city, kitchen by kitchen, apartment by apartment. A distributed system with no centre to shut down, no leader to arrest, no single point of failure. It was everywhere, and it was made of nothing more exotic than matchboxes and pharmacy receipts. The authorities would eventually find an answer. It would take 3 more years and an uncountable number of bodies to force that answer into law. Dmitri stopped complaining about his leg on a Wednesday. This should have been a warning sign. It wasn't. Or rather, it was. And everyone in the apartment recognized it as one, and filed it in the same place they filed all warning signs, which was somewhere behind the next cook. Pain, in the context of Krokodil use, was a constant. Background radiation. Everyone hurt in some configuration at all times. The wounds, the injections, the withdrawal cycles that came every 90 minutes like a tide that never fully went out. When pain reduced, the instinct was relief, not suspicion. The possibility that pain was reducing because the nerve endings responsible for transmitting it had been destroyed by spreading infection was not a conclusion that felt natural to reach from inside the situation. It felt natural only from outside it, in the clean retrospective light of a medical report written after the fact. Dmitri's leg abscess had been present for 6 weeks. The fist-sized swelling on his shin had progressed through stages that Alexei had watched with sideways attention, growing, darkening, developing the surface texture that the group had learned to recognize without naming. Dmitri had treated it himself. Hot compresses, improvised drainage he performed once with a syringe needle, while Lena held a flashlight, antibiotics he obtained without prescription from a source in their network. The self-treatment had the same relationship to actual medical care that a garden hose has to a fire suppression system. It addressed the surface presentation, while the underlying process continued undisturbed. The Wednesday when the pain stopped was in late May. By Thursday, Dmitri was moving around the apartment with noticeably less careful gait, not because the leg had improved, but because the sensory feedback from that area of his body had been silenced. The infection had reached deep enough tissue that the nerves there were no longer transmitting coherent signals. He interpreted this as progress. He cooked that afternoon with better energy than he'd had in weeks, and Alexei, watching him, felt something that wasn't quite relief but resembled it enough to be mistaken for it. By Friday evening, Dmitri had a fever. Not dramatic, not the cinematic sweat-soaked delirium of a period film. A quiet fever, the kind that makes a person slightly slower and slightly warmer to the touch, and slightly more likely to fall asleep in a chair. Alexei noticed the temperature when Dmitri fell asleep at the kitchen table at 9 in the evening, which was unusual. He pressed the back of his hand to Dmitri's forehead, warm, noticeably warm, and stood there for a moment making the calculation that everyone in that apartment made constantly. How serious is this? And does serious enough exist to justify the disruption of calling for help? He let him sleep. This decision would not leave Alexei easily in the years that followed. Sepsis, bloodstream infection, progresses on a timeline that has no interest in the schedules of the people it's affecting. The bacteria that had been working through Dmitri's leg tissue for 6 weeks had found, at some point in the preceding days, a passage into the circulatory system. Once in the blood, they travelled efficiently. The immune system responded with the full-scale inflammatory reaction that sepsis triggers, a response so aggressive that it begins to damage the body's own organs in the process of fighting the infection. The fever was not the disease. The fever was the body at war with the disease, and the body was losing. Dmitri was alive on Saturday morning. He was breathing, heart rate elevated, still feverish, and largely unresponsive to attempts to wake him fully. Alexei stood over him for 15 minutes performing the internal arithmetic of someone trying to avoid the only conclusion the numbers actually supported. Lena appeared in the kitchen doorway, looked at Dmitri, looked at Alexei, and the look that passed between them was the first fully honest communication the apartment had produced in months. No cover story, no minimization, just two people acknowledging simultaneously that this was beyond the boundary of what they could manage themselves. The ambulance arrived 12 minutes after Alexei called. The paramedics worked with the efficient, effectless professionalism of people who'd seen enough to maintain composure through anything. They asked questions. Alexei answered some of them accurately and some of them inaccurately, following the internal rule that protected the kitchen from official attention. He said Dmitri had an infected leg wound. He did not say how it had occurred. The paramedics examining the wound did not press for elaboration. They had their own framework for categorizing what they were seeing, and the category required no additional information from Alexei. Dmitri did not regain full consciousness in the apartment. He was loaded onto a stretcher and carried down 4 flights of stairs by paramedics, who moved with the careful efficiency of people who had carried people down many flights of stairs. Alexei followed them to the ambulance, watched the doors close, and stood on the pavement in the early morning light of a Saturday that was already warm, already populated with ordinary weekend sounds. A child's bicycle, a radio from an open window, someone arguing cheerfully with someone else about something that didn't matter. He never saw Dmitri alive again. The hospital worked on Dmitri for 11 days. Sepsis treatment requires aggressive intervention, intravenous antibiotics, fluid resuscitation, often vasopressors to maintain blood pressure as the cardiovascular system comes under strain. The leg required surgical debridement that went significantly deeper than the surface wound had suggested. The infection had tracked along the bone, a condition called osteomyelitis that the surgical team found when they opened the abscess and discovered it went further than any of them had expected. They cleaned what they could. They amputated below the knee on day 4, when it became clear that the tissue below that point was unsalvageable and continuing to seed the bloodstream with bacteria. Dmitri died on day 11, not during surgery, not from any single catastrophic event. His kidneys failed first, a common sepsis complication, the organ succumbing to the combination of infection, inflammatory response, and the chronic damage that months of Krokodil-delivered toxins had been accumulating quietly in the background. The cardiac event that the death certificate recorded as cause of death was the end of a cascade, not the beginning of one. He was 26 years old. The death certificate said cardiac failure. This was technically accurate, the way saying a building collapsed due to gravity is technically accurate. True at the level of the final mechanism, silent about everything that led to the mechanism engaging. Nobody investigated. There was no inquiry into the apartment, no official examination of the kitchen, no formal documentation connecting Dmitri's death to a broader pattern of identical deaths occurring across Yekaterinburg and a dozen other Russian cities simultaneously. He was a young man who had died of heart failure, and the city processed that fact with the bureaucratic efficiency it applied to all unremarkable deaths. His mother was told by a hospital administrator. She identified the body. She arranged a funeral for the following Thursday, a modest service at a cemetery on the city's northern edge. Alexei attended, wearing his least damaged jacket, long sleeves in weather that was already warm enough to make long sleeves conspicuous. He stood at the graveside among people he didn't know, Dmitri's relatives, neighbours, a few people from his earlier life before the apartment, and looked at the coffin with the specific expression of someone trying to feel grief fully and finding that the machinery for feeling it has been slightly damaged. He felt grief for 2 days. He felt it genuinely, not as performance. Loss that was real and specific, tied to memories that predated the apartment and the cooking and everything that had come after. Dmitri, at a birthday party, before any of this. Dmitri, magnetic and loud and entirely convinced that consequences were someone else's problem. On the 3rd day, the withdrawal arrived and reorganized everything else around itself. This was not callousness. This was neurochemistry. The brain's dopamine and endorphin systems so thoroughly restructured by dependency that they simply overrode everything else when the cycle demanded it. Grief, guilt, loss. All of it existed. All of it was real. All of it was temporarily but completely subordinated to the physical demand of the drug. Alexei went back to the kitchen. He cooked alone for the first time. His hands moved through the steps with the mechanical fluency of deep practice, crushing, filtering, heating, reducing, and the result came out correctly, the way things come out correctly when you've done them enough times that the body does them without the mind's active participation. He drew it into the syringe. He found a vein in his right arm, the less damaged side, and injected. Something had shifted in the apartment's weight. Not metaphorically, the actual social atmosphere, the human texture of the space, had changed with Dmitri's absence. He had been the organizing force, the one who sourced the tablets, managed the network, kept the operation connected to the world outside. Now, Alexei was the one who knew how to cook. He was the one with the knowledge and the space and the implicit obligation to the people who still came to the apartment. This was not a role he had sought. It had simply settled onto him in Dmitri's absence, the way responsibility tends to settle onto whoever is left standing. He became the supplier, a role with a poisoned kind of purpose, the sense of being needed, of mattering to the small ecosystem of the apartment, in a situation where every other form of mattering had been stripped away. It was the worst possible reason to continue. It was reason enough. Lena Sorokina had started using opioids at 19 for a reason that was neither dramatic nor unusual, which made it, in some ways, harder to argue with. She'd been depressed since she was 16. Not the colloquial depression of difficult weeks and low moods, the clinical kind, the persistent structural kind that sits behind every experience like a filter that removes certain frequencies of light. She had told a school counsellor once, who had referred her to a doctor, who had prescribed something mild that helped slightly and then stopped helping. The Russian mental health infrastructure of the early 2000s was not equipped to pursue the problem further, and Lena was not equipped to pursue it through a system that communicated at every step that her suffering was a mild administrative inconvenience. She stopped going to appointments. The depression stayed. Heroin, the first time she tried it, did something that no medication had managed. It silenced the static. Not eliminated, not cured, not even addressed. Silenced. For the duration of the high, the persistent background wrongness of her neurochemistry simply was not there. This is what opioids do for people with untreated depression or anxiety or chronic pain. They don't provide pleasure so much as they provide the temporary experience of being a person whose brain is not working against them. The relief is so specific and so complete that the brain encodes it as the solution to the actual problem, which it is not, and this encoding is the beginning of the end. She arrived at Alexei's apartment already dependent on opioids, already managing the same supply crisis everyone in their network was managing, already making the same calculation about Krokodil. She was practical about it in a way that was both impressive and terrible. She assessed the risks with clear eyes, decided that the alternative was withdrawal she couldn't afford to treat, and made the switch with the same methodical logic she had applied to everything that had failed to save her. Her family had not given up on her the first time she disappeared for a weekend. They had not given up on her the second or third time either. They gave up sometime around the 4th month, when the combination of the chemical smell on her clothes, the marks on her arms, and a confrontation that went badly in every direction, produced a rupture that Lena described to no one but that was visible in the way she stopped mentioning home. She moved her remaining belongings into Alexei's apartment in a single bag that contained 3 changes of clothes, a photograph, and a nursing textbook she never opened but never threw away either. She was 20 years old and she was living in a Krokodil kitchen, and she was, despite all of this, one of the more functional people in the apartment. She maintained a cleaner synthesis process than anyone else. Her nursing background surfaced in the way she filtered the product, the care she took with sterilizing equipment, the attention to wound care that she applied to herself, and occasionally to others when they let her. She had learned enough clinical procedure to know exactly how inadequate her improvised treatments were, which put her in the specific position of watching a disaster unfold with professional clarity while being unable to stop participating in it. Her left arm was her primary injection site. By June, 3 months into Krokodil use, the damage was concentrated there. A section from wrist to mid-forearm that had developed the now familiar pattern of necrosis, multiple ulcers connected by ridges of dead tissue, the skin between them taking on the hardened, scaled texture that gave the drug its name. She dressed the wounds herself, daily, with the systematic attention of someone performing clinical procedure. The dressings were clean. The wounds beneath them were not healing. She had, at some point in June, injected once into her face. The circumstances were specific. The veins in both arms were compromised enough that she'd been searching for viable sites, and there is a facial vein, the angular vein near the cheek, that some Krokodil users accessed in desperation. She did it once. The result was visible within days, a sunken area in her left cheek where the tissue beneath the skin had begun to die. The surface skin intact, but the structure below it collapsing, like a house that looks fine from the outside while the foundation dissolves. She did not inject there again. The damage from a single injection was already irreversible. This was the specific cruelty of Krokodil's tissue destruction. It didn't require repetition at a site to cause permanent damage. One injection of sufficiently impure desomorphine solution could introduce enough chemical injury to initiate a necrotic process that then continued on its own. The body's inflammatory response perpetuating the tissue death after the original insult was long gone. Lena understood this. She had the knowledge base to understand it. Understanding it and stopping were, as had been established throughout her life, different capabilities. A volunteer arrived at the apartment in late June. Not police, not medical authorities, a harm reduction worker, a woman in her 30s who operated through an unofficial network that existed in the gap between the formal medical system and the reality of what was happening in these apartments. She came because someone in the network had mentioned the apartment as a place where people needed wound care supplies. She brought bandages, antiseptic, antibiotics obtained through channels Alexei didn't ask about, and a camera. Not official documentation, her own camera, a small digital device she carried in her jacket pocket. She was not aggressive or confrontational. She worked quietly, cleaning wounds with professional efficiency, distributing supplies, asking medical questions and noting answers in a small notebook. Lena submitted to the wound assessment with the resigned cooperation of someone who had stopped pretending the wounds weren't there. The volunteer photographed the arm wounds after obtaining, through a look that communicated both request and understanding of what agreement meant, something approaching consent. She photographed Lena's arm in clinical detail, the full length of the damage, the satellite ulcers, the exposed tissue at the worst site near the wrist where the necrosis had progressed to the point where the tendon sheath was partially visible through the wound bed. She also photographed Lena's face, the sunken cheek, lit by the kitchen window light, with the matter-of-fact documentary framing of someone who has decided that making things visible is the only tool available. Those photographs left the apartment in the volunteer's jacket pocket and travelled through a chain of contacts that ended weeks later with a journalist. The journalist was working on a piece about Krokodil that would become one of the first major Western media reports on the epidemic, a story that would run in European and American publications and produce a wave of international horror that Russian officials would find difficult to publicly ignore. The photographs Lena's face appeared in did not name her. She became a documentation of a phenomenon, a visual argument for a policy change, evidence in an ongoing case against a system that had failed her in every possible direction. Lena never learned any of this. The photographs circulated. The articles ran. People in Germany and Britain and the United States encountered her face over breakfast and experienced the kind of distant, helpless horror that media documentation of distant suffering produces. They did not know her name. They knew nothing about the nursing program, the depression that started at 16, the textbook she kept but never opened, the photograph in her bag that she looked at sometimes when she thought no one was watching. She died in August 2009. The specific day was the 14th, a Wednesday, in the apartment she'd been living in for 5 months. The cause was sepsis, originating from the arm wounds that had never had a genuine chance to heal. She was 21 years old. The process was not different from Dimitri's. The same silent progression of infection into bloodstream, the same cascade of organ response, the same end point. The differences were only circumstantial. Different wound location, different timeline, different person lying on the kitchen floor when Alexei found her in the morning and understood immediately, from the quality of her stillness, that she was not asleep. He called an ambulance. He stayed until they arrived. He answered their questions with the directness that was new. Something in him had shifted with the second death. Some calculation had changed, and he no longer had the energy to manage the cover story with full conviction. He told them more than he had told anyone official before, not everything. Enough that the report the paramedics filed contained language that connected to the growing pattern of documentation that health officials in the region were slowly, reluctantly assembling. The ambulance took Lena away. The apartment was quiet in a way it hadn't been before, a different kind of quiet than Dimitri's absence had produced, because Lena had been quieter than Dimitri, and her absence was therefore harder to distinguish from her presence until you looked for her specifically and found empty space. Alexei sat at the kitchen table for a long time. The cooking equipment was in front of him. His withdrawal would start in approximately 2 hours. He sat and looked at the table and did something he hadn't done in months. Absolutely nothing, for a full 20 minutes, without the mental machinery of planning the next cook or managing the next supply run or calculating the next injection time. Just sitting. Just the weight of 2 people dead in 3 months, settling into a body that was itself already significantly destroyed, in a kitchen that smelled of chemicals and everything that chemicals had replaced. Then he got up and started cooking. Not because he had decided to, because 2 hours is not a long time, and the body's demands are not interested in grief's timeline. The apartment after Lena's death had a different atmosphere than the apartment after Dimitri's. Dimitri's absence had created a vacuum that filled quickly. New people, new logistics, the poisoned purpose of becoming the supplier. Lena's absence created something that didn't fill. It just stayed empty, a specific shape of missing person that the apartment's geography kept outlining. Her bag was still in the corner of the main room. Her nursing textbook was on the shelf where she had put it the first week. Nobody moved these things, not because they were sacred, but because moving them required acknowledging their significance, which required a level of emotional processing that the drug cycle didn't leave room for. The 2 others who had been cycling through the apartment in the weeks before Lena's death stopped coming within a week of it. Not dramatically. They simply appeared less frequently, then not at all. The apartment had acquired a reputation within their network, the specific reputation of a place where people died, which is a reputation that even people in desperate circumstances find ways to root around. Alexei was left with the kitchen, the equipment, and himself. Alone was a new condition. He had not been genuinely alone, without regular human presence in the apartment, since before Dimitri had entered his life. The solitude arrived not as peace, but as exposure, the way removing background noise exposes sounds you didn't know were there. Without other people to manage, without the social logistics of a shared operation, the only thing in the apartment that required his attention was himself, and himself in the late summer of 2009 was a deteriorating situation that he had been successfully avoiding examining directly for months. His left arm was the primary document of that deterioration. The wound complex that had started as a single ulcer in April had expanded through the summer into a connected landscape of necrotic tissue covering most of the inner forearm. The largest wound measured, by Alexei's own rough estimate, approximately the size of his palm. The tissue at the centre was no longer recognizable as skin. It was dark, hard at the edges and wet at the centre, a border territory between what was dead and what was dying. The smell was constant. He had adapted to it the same way he had adapted to the cooking smell, completely, which is to say, the adaptation was so thorough that he only noticed the smell when he was outside the apartment and then came back in. He had shifted his primary injection sites to his right arm, his groin, and occasionally his neck. This progression, the systematic migration across the body, as each region became too damaged to use, was one of Krokodil's most consistent patterns. The body is large enough to provide new territory for some time. The neck was recent and frightening in a way the other sites weren't, because the veins there are close to critical structures and the margin for injection error is small. He was careful. Careful, in this context, meaning that he applied the same technical precision to injecting into his neck that he applied to everything else, methodically, without drama, the way you do things you have normalized past the point of recognizing their danger. The cognitive changes were harder to document than the physical ones because they affected the instrument being used to detect them. His memory had developed gaps, not the dramatic amnesia of film, but practical gaps, the kind that manifest as standing in a room without knowing why you went there, or starting a sentence and losing the second half before it arrives. Words were occasionally unavailable. He would reach for a specific word and find the space where it should be occupied by something adjacent but wrong, a synonym that wasn't quite right, a description substituting for the noun. He noticed this. Noticing it required the cognitive function he was losing, which created a narrowing window of self-awareness that he could feel closing without being able to stop it. Desomorphine's neurotoxicity was a documented property of the compound, even in its pure pharmaceutical form. In the impure form that Krokodil provided, loaded with solvent residues, phosphorus byproducts, heavy metals, the damage was compounded by direct chemical insult to brain tissue, delivered across the blood-brain barrier with every injection. The white matter, the brain's connective tissue, the infrastructure that allows different regions to communicate, was particularly vulnerable. The effects accumulated slowly and expressed themselves as exactly what Alexei was experiencing: memory degradation, word retrieval problems, reduced processing speed, an emotional flattening that was not peace, but the neurological equivalent of a dimmer switch turned partway down. He found himself sitting in the kitchen for long periods without purpose, not thinking, not in the directed sequential way that thinking usually works, more floating, the mind moving without destination, attaching briefly to images or fragments and releasing them. He would come back to awareness having lost an hour he couldn't account for. The experience was not unpleasant in itself. There was something almost restful about it. The way a power outage in a noisy building is briefly peaceful before it becomes a problem. But it was happening with increasing frequency, and the duration was increasing, and Alexei understood on some level that what felt like rest was actually loss. His mother came in September. She'd been calling the apartment's landline. Alexei's mobile had been disconnected for non-payment months earlier, and when she finally reached him, his voice on the phone had communicated something that made her take a bus across the city the following morning without asking permission or announcing a time. She arrived at 10. He opened the door and she looked at him with the specific expression that only people who have known you since before you existed can produce. A look that measures the present against a baseline that goes back decades. What she saw, her son, 24 years old, weighing somewhere between 48 and 50 kilograms on a frame that had been built for 65. Left arm wrapped in bandaging that hadn't been changed recently enough. Eyes that were present but operating at reduced capacity like lights on a dimmer. The apartment behind him smelling of things she didn't have names for but understood instinctively were wrong. She didn't shout. She had passed the stage of shouting sometime in the previous months, had moved through it and come out the other side into something quieter and more absolute. a grief that had given up on anger, because anger requires the belief that things could be different, and she was no longer sure they could. She cried instead, standing in the doorway, and Alexei watched his mother cry with the dimmed emotional processing that the drug had left him with, feeling something real and specific that he could not fully access, like a room he could see through a window but not enter. He asked her to leave. Not cruelly, with the specific gentleness of someone who knows that their presence is causing harm to someone they care about, and whose solution is to remove the witness rather than the cause. She left. She walked down 4 flights of stairs and out onto the street and stood there for a while before she started walking to the bus stop. She would later tell a social worker that she had looked up at his window from the street and seen him standing there watching her go, one arm raised slightly, a gesture that might have been a wave. The loneliness that followed her departure was absolute in a way that company had previously prevented Alexei from fully measuring. Alone in the apartment, stripped of the social logistics that had provided structure, without Dmitri's energy or Lena's quiet presence, or even the rotating cast of peripheral people that an active kitchen attracts, he was left with the unmediated truth of his situation. The drug cycle provided the only rhythm: cook, inject, plateau, crash, cook again. Everything else had contracted around that rhythm until nothing else remained. He began losing track of days, not dramatically. He knew approximately what week it was, roughly what month. But the specific day, the date, became information he stopped reliably maintaining. Days were measured in injection cycles rather than calendar units. 3 cycles was a day. 12 cycles was 4 days. Time had reorganized itself around the only schedule that still had consequences. He ate irregularly and insufficiently. Food had lost most of its interest. Another consequence of opioid restructuring of the brain's reward system, which assigns motivational priority to the drug and distributes what remains across everything else. He ate when he remembered to, and when food was available, which were 2 conditions that didn't always coincide. He was losing weight that he didn't have to lose, his body consuming its own reserves in the methodical way of a system running on emergency power. One evening in late September, he looked at his reflection in the bathroom mirror for the first time in weeks. He had been avoiding mirrors with the unconscious efficiency of someone who knows that the information they contain is not going to be useful. The face that looked back was recognizable as his, but operating under significant revision. The geometry changed by weight loss, the skin color wrong in the way that chronic illness changes skin color, the eyes carrying an expression he didn't have a name for, but that an experienced clinician would have identified immediately as the look of someone whose body has been in a prolonged emergency state for long enough that emergency has become the baseline. He looked at the reflection for a long time, then he went back to the kitchen. The cook would take 40 minutes, the high would last 90, the withdrawal would arrive 2 hours after that. This was the complete territory of his life, and it fit in a single room, and it was going to kill him, and he could see all of this clearly and simultaneously could not convert that clarity into action. Outside, September was ending. The first cold was arriving in Yekaterinburg, the air sharpening overnight into something that carried winter's advance notice. The city was preparing for a season that would make everything harder. The cold, the dark, the particular weight of Russian winter on cities already carrying significant weight. Alexei's apartment had no functioning radiator in the main room. He had known this since he moved in, and had meant to report it to the landlord. He never had. Some things stay broken because fixing them requires a kind of forward thinking that assumes the future matters enough to prepare for. He pulled his jacket tighter and went to check whether he had enough matches for the morning cook. October arrived and Alexei's body made a decision his mind had been postponing for months. He collapsed on a Thursday morning, on a street 4 blocks from the apartment, on his way back from a pharmacy run. Not a dramatic collapse. No warning symptoms he'd registered, no build-up. One moment he was walking, carrying a paper bag of codeine tablets, and the next he was on the pavement with the side of his face against cold concrete, and no clear memory of the transition between those two states. A woman walking her dog found him. She called an ambulance without hesitating, which was the fastest decision anyone had made on Alexei's behalf in months. The paramedics who arrived were different from the ones who had taken Dmitri. Different crew, different shift, same professional efficiency. They assessed him on the pavement with practiced speed, noted the bandaging on his left arm, noted his weight, noted his responsiveness level, partial, capable of answering simple questions with single words, and made the categorization that the situation required without editorializing. The paper bag of codeine tablets was still in his hand. One of the paramedics removed it gently, noted its contents, and placed it in the ambulance in a way that neither concealed the observation nor made it confrontational. Documentation without accusation. He had probably done this before. The hospital that received Alexei was a general public facility, underfunded, overpopulated, operating in the specific register of Russian public healthcare that functioned through the heroic individual effort of staff working with inadequate resources inside a system that asked too much and provided too little. The receiving physician was a woman in her early 40s named, according to her badge, Dr. Marchenko. She assessed Alexei in the intake area, with the systematic thoroughness of someone who had learned that the presenting problem and the actual problem were rarely identical. The actual problem, unwrapped: severe malnutrition, dehydration, multiple infected wounds at various stages of progression, evidence of systemic infection beginning to manifest in blood markers that the initial blood work returned within the hour. The left arm wound complex was the most urgent surgical concern. The largest ulcer had progressed to a depth that now involved the underlying fascia, the connective tissue layer beneath the skin, and subcutaneous fat, and the infection at the wound margin was actively advancing. The right arm showed earlier stage damage at injection sites. The groin injection sites were inflamed. The neck sites, when the nurse examined them, caused a pause that communicated more than any verbal response. Dr. Marchenko had been practicing medicine for 18 years. She had treated industrial accidents, burns, frostbite, the ordinary catastrophic range of human physical emergency. She had started seeing krokodil wounds 6 months earlier, first one patient, then 3, then a steady stream that had become, by October, a consistent feature of her emergency intake rotation. She understood what she was looking at when she looked at Alexei's arm. She had developed a clinical protocol for it in the absence of any official guidance, because no official guidance existed. She had constructed her approach from first principles, from wound care literature, from conversations with colleagues at other hospitals who were developing their own improvised protocols for the same problem. The surgical debridement of the left arm wound happened on the second day. Alexei was conscious for the preoperative preparation and anaesthetized for the procedure itself. Debridement, the surgical removal of dead, damaged or infected tissue, is not a gentle process even when the patient is unconscious. The surgeon removed tissue from the wound bed until reaching margins that bled cleanly, indicating viable tissue. The amount removed was significant. The wound left after debridement was larger than the wound that had preceded it, because the dead tissue that had been covering the damage was now gone, and the true extent of what remained was visible without concealment. When Alexei woke from the anesthesia, a nurse told him the procedure had gone well. This was true in the surgical sense. The debridement had been complete, the infection at the wound site had been addressed, the margins were clean. In the broader sense, well was doing significant work. He had a wound on his forearm the size of a large man's hand, open to the air under dressings, that would require weeks of treatment and would heal, if it healed, with scarring so extensive that the functional use of the arm would be permanently compromised. He spent 2 weeks in the hospital. This was the longest period of sustained medical care his body had received in the entire arc of his Krokodil use, and the contrast between that care and everything that had preceded it was stark enough to be disorienting. Regular meals appeared on a tray 3 times a day. Nurses changed his dressings with clean equipment and proper technique. Antibiotics arrived intravenously on schedule, maintaining blood levels that actually addressed the infection rather than merely gesturing at it. His weight began fractionally increasing. The systemic infection markers in his blood declined over 5 days from alarming to concerning to, by the end of the 2nd week, merely elevated. What the hospital could not do was treat the addiction, not because the staff didn't recognize it or care about it. Dr. Machenko's notes in his file were detailed and unsentimental, documenting both the physical damage and its cause with clinical precision. She referred him to the hospital's narcology consultant on day 4, a man who visited Alexei's bed, spoke with him for 40 minutes, and left behind a written care plan that was thorough, evidence-based, and entirely dependent on a level of post-discharge infrastructure that didn't exist in any form Alexei could actually access. The narcology consultant was not cynical. He was realistic, which in the Russian addiction treatment landscape of 2009 produced recommendations that were theoretically correct and practically near impossible. Residential treatment for at least 6 months, followed by structured outpatient support, followed by long-term monitoring and social reintegration assistance. Each component of this plan assumed the existence of a functional system providing it. The functional system did not exist at the scale required. There were beds somewhere. There were counsellors, stretched thin. There was almost nothing that addressed the physical reality of what Krokodil had done to Alexei's body, alongside what it had done to his neurochemistry. Withdrawal in the hospital was managed. This was the clinical term, managed, meaning the symptoms were addressed sufficiently to prevent the most dangerous physical complications without eliminating the experience of withdrawal itself. Alexei went through it in a hospital bed with monitoring equipment attached, which was materially better than going through it on a kitchen floor. The bone pain, the specific, deep architectural pain of opioid withdrawal that feels like the skeleton is registering a formal complaint, was addressed with medications that took the edge off without eliminating it. He slept in fragments. He was awake for long stretches at 3 and 4 in the morning, listening to the sounds of a hospital at night, the distant movement of staff, the occasional equipment alarm from another ward, the particular institutional quiet of a building full of damaged people trying to get through the dark. A nurse named Galina worked the night shift on his ward and checked on him more frequently than the minimum protocol required. She was somewhere in her 50s, efficient and unsentimental in manner but consistent in attention, and she had the quality of certain experienced medical workers of communicating care through action rather than language. She brought him tea at 2 in the morning on 3 consecutive nights. She didn't comment on the wounds or the cause or the situation. She brought tea, confirmed he was stable, and moved on. This was, in the context of Alexei's recent months, an act of extraordinary ordinary kindness. On day 12, a different doctor, covering for Dr. Machenko on her day off, reviewed Alexei's file and determined he was medically stable for discharge. Technically, this was accurate. The acute infection was controlled, the wound was progressing through early healing stages, his vital signs were normal, his nutrition status had improved measurably. Medically stable is a specific category with specific criteria, and he met them. The criteria did not include has functional support systems outside the hospital, or is not going to walk directly back into the situation that produced the admission. He received his discharge documentation on a Thursday afternoon. 2 weeks exactly from the Thursday morning he'd collapsed on the pavement 4 blocks from his apartment. The paperwork included wound care instructions, an antibiotic prescription to complete the course, and the narcology consultant's care plan printed on 2 pages that he folded and put in his jacket pocket. He received a brief conversation with a discharge nurse who reviewed the wound care process and gave him clean dressing sufficient for approximately 1 week. He thanked the staff with a genuine courtesy that had persisted through everything. He meant it. He walked out of the hospital into October air that was cold enough now to be definitively autumnal. The warmth fully gone, the light reduced, the city in the grey-brown register of a Russian pre-winter that has decided summer is finished. He stood outside the entrance for a moment, the discharge papers in his pocket, the week's worth of dressings in a plastic bag, the narcology care plan folded alongside the antibiotic prescription. He turned left instead of right. The apartment was in the left direction. The narcology centre the care plan recommended was in the right direction, 40 minutes by tram. He knew both of these facts simultaneously and turned left with a full awareness of what he was doing, which was perhaps worse than turning left without awareness, and perhaps not. Perhaps the awareness was the last functioning part of the system that would eventually save him, if anything was going to. He was back in the kitchen within 36 hours. The apartment was cold, the radiator still broken, the kitchen table still carrying the residue of the operation he'd left behind. He sat down, looked at the table, and felt the withdrawal beginning its familiar ascent. 2 weeks of managed hospital detox had reset his tolerance significantly, which meant the drug would hit harder now, which the brain's reward system registered as information about what to look forward to. He started cooking. The process was mechanical and perfect. His hands hadn't forgotten anything. November came in hard that year. Yekaterinburg under early winter is a specific kind of difficult. The cold arriving not gradually but decisively, temperatures dropping below 0 in the first week and staying there, the sky closing to a flat grey ceiling that the sun barely penetrates. The city contracts in November. People move faster outdoors and stay inside longer, and the social temperature drops alongside the physical one, everyone conserving something. Alexei's apartment had no functioning heat in the main room, and inadequate heat in the kitchen. He had addressed this by spending most of his time in the kitchen, which had a small electric burner that produced warmth as a byproduct of the cooking process. The cooking process now ran almost continuously, not because his consumption had increased dramatically, but because his efficiency had decreased. His hands, once technically precise instruments of the synthesis, were less reliable now. The tremor had worsened. The cognitive gaps that had been appearing since summer were wider and more frequent. He sometimes completed a step in the process and immediately couldn't remember whether he'd completed it, which meant starting over, which wasted materials and time and produced occasionally batches of inconsistent quality. He weighed somewhere under 50 kilograms. He knew this not from a scale, he didn't own one, but from the empirical evidence of his own body, the way his clothes hung, the visibility of his skeleton at wrists and shoulders and jaw, the way the cold hit him faster than it should have because there was insufficient insulation between his bones and the air. Malnutrition in Krokodil users followed a predictable pattern. The drug suppressed appetite, the addiction consumed money that would otherwise buy food, the cognitive deterioration reduced the capacity for self-care, and the result was a body eating itself from the inside at the same rate the drug was destroying it from the outside. His jaw had started hurting in October, a week after the hospital discharge, a deep structural ache distinct from the ordinary pain of his wounds. He had initially attributed it to withdrawal, which produces bone pain that can manifest anywhere. But withdrawal pain is symmetrical and generalized, and this was localized. Right side of the jaw, the bone itself, a persistent dull pain that intensified when he chewed and was present even when he didn't. He didn't investigate it beyond pressing his fingers against the outside of his jaw and noting that the bone felt wrong, slightly changed in contour, as if something was happening beneath the surface that hadn't finished happening yet. What was happening was osteonecrosis. The same process that was destroying tissue throughout his body had reached bone, specifically the mandible, the jawbone, in a presentation that would later be documented in medical literature as a characteristic feature of long-term Krokodil use. The impurities in the drug, particularly the phosphorus compounds, had a specific affinity for bone tissue, disrupting the biological processes of bone remodeling, the constant cycle of breakdown and renewal that keeps bone healthy, until the bones simply began to die from the inside. The condition had a historical precedent that Alexei had never encountered: radium jaw, the disease that killed workers in early 20th century luminous watch factories, caused by a different chemical, but producing near identical bone destruction through a related mechanism. The women who painted watch dials with radium in the 1920s and the young men cooking Krokodil in Yekaterinburg in 2009 shared a pathology separated by 80 years and connected by chemistry. He ate less as November progressed, partly because the jaw pain made chewing increasingly difficult, and partly because the capacity to prioritize food over the drug's demands had effectively ceased to exist. He ate soft things, bread soaked in water, occasionally soup from a can heated on the burner, and sometimes didn't eat at all for a day, and didn't register it consciously as a problem until he stood up too fast and the world tilted in a way that required holding the table. His pharmacy network had contracted to a single route. The rotating system that Dmitri had established, multiple pharmacies, multiple buyers, distributed purchasing to avoid pattern recognition, had collapsed with the apartment's social infrastructure. Alexei was buying codeine himself, from 2 pharmacies within walking distance, alternating between them on a schedule he maintained by habit rather than strategy. The pharmacists at both locations knew him. They had been selling him codeine tablets in quantities that required no particular imagination to interpret for months. Neither had reported anything to anyone, a fact that would later contribute to the documented pattern of pharmacy-level complicity. Not active, not malicious, simply the complicity of a system that had no mechanism requiring action and sufficient incentive to avoid the administrative disruption of raising flags. On a Tuesday in the second week of November, he woke on the kitchen floor. Not beside the table, actually on the floor, collapsed against the cabinet under the sink with no clear memory of how he had gotten there. The last thing he remembered was standing at the burner during the afternoon cook. It was now dark outside, which meant somewhere between 4 and 8 hours had passed. He had a bruise on his left temple from the fall, a cut on his right palm from the cabinet handle, and the immediate and urgent demand of withdrawal already well advanced, which meant he'd been unconscious long enough for the drug to clear his system significantly, which required immediate calculation about whether he had the materials for a cook. He did. He got up slowly, using the cabinet as support, and took physical inventory in the systematic way that had become his primary relationship with his own body. Not how do I feel, but what is functional and what is not. Left arm, limited mobility, wound complex requiring dressing change overdue by 2 days. Right arm, injection sites tender but usable. Jaw, persistent pain, elevated today. Standing, possible with support initially, independent after 30 seconds. Hands, tremor present, manageable. He cooked. It took longer than it should have because his hands were less steady than they'd been the previous week, and less steady the previous week than the week before that. The degradation was incremental but consistent. A measurable decline in fine motor control, that the neurotoxicity was producing on a timeline indifferent to his awareness of it. The batch came out acceptable. He injected, found the vein on the third attempt. The second attempt produced a small bleed beneath the skin that he pressed a piece of cloth against briefly before continuing, and felt the drug arrive with the particular quality it had now, which was less warmth and fullness than it had once been, and more simply, the cessation of the symptoms of not having it. This is where long-term opioid dependency eventually arrives for everyone who travels far enough down the road, the point where the drug stops producing anything positive and produces only the removal of the negative. The high was gone in any meaningful sense. What remained was a maintenance cycle, the brain's altered chemistry requiring the drug simply to function at baseline, the way a car with a broken thermostat requires constant water just to run at normal temperature. The pleasure had been spent. Only the necessity remained. His neighbour from 2 floors below, not Zinaida, who had moved away in September, but a man named Volodya, middle-aged, who worked somewhere and asked no questions, knocked on the door one evening in mid-November with an expression that communicated he had been deciding whether to knock for some time before committing to it. He had heard sounds from the apartment that concerned him, not the chemical smell, which was simply the building's ambient reality on the 4th floor by this point. Sounds of someone moving poorly, falling, the specific acoustic signature of a person not managing well inside a space. Alexei opened the door, and Volodya looked at him for a moment with the expression of someone whose concern and whose willingness to involve himself in another person's crisis were arriving at different speeds. He asked if Alexei needed anything. Alexei said no with the automatic reflexiveness of someone who'd been saying no to that question for so long that it no longer required processing. Volodya looked at him for another moment, then went back downstairs. 3 days later, Alexei fell again. This time it happened in the kitchen during the morning cook, and this time he didn't get up easily. He was conscious, not disoriented, not in the altered state of the previous floor incident, but simply unable to immediately produce the muscular coordination required to stand from the kitchen floor. He lay there for several minutes, looking at the underside of the kitchen table, noting the specific detail of a crumb caught in a groove in the table leg that he had presumably put there himself at some earlier point in his life, when he had been a person who ate meals at kitchen tables. The ceiling light was on. The burner had a pot on it, still heating, a fire hazard he recognized abstractly without being able to immediately address. He reached up to the table edge and pulled himself to a sitting position, then to the chair. The pot was boiling over and he reached and moved it off the heat with the automatic muscle memory of someone who has done a specific motion thousands of times. The batch was salvageable. He filtered it. He drew it into the syringe. He was aware, sitting in the chair with the syringe in his right hand, that this moment had a weight to it. Not a final weight. He wasn't constructing a narrative of endings, but a different quality of awareness than his sessions usually carried, a clarity that might have been the brain's occasional resurfacing from beneath the chemical sediment, the way winter water sometimes runs clear. He was 47 kilograms. He was alone. His jawbone was dying. His left arm was a wound map. He was sitting on a kitchen floor chair, having just pulled himself upright from the linoleum, preparing to inject a substance he had synthesized from matchboxes and pharmacy receipts in a cold apartment in November in a city that didn't know he existed. He injected. The clarity faded as the drug arrived. The warmth that wasn't warmth anymore moved through him, and the sharp edges of everything softened to the distance he needed them at. Outside, Yekaterinburg's November made its sounds. Wind on the building's corners, a tram's metal complaint somewhere below, the low register of a city operating on reduced winter frequencies. Volodya called the ambulance that evening. He had heard the fall through the floor. He had waited an hour to see if the sounds resumed. Evidence that the person above was moving, functional. No sounds resumed. He picked up his phone and dialed, and the decision took less than 30 seconds, which was faster than anyone had made a decision on Alexei's behalf in a long time. The paramedics found him on the kitchen floor. Not unconscious, present, responsive, capable of confirming his name and address, but incapable of standing without assistance, and when the lead paramedic looked at the apartment, the kitchen table, the equipment, the smell, the bandaged arms, the jaw visibly swollen on the right side now, Alexei's body weight on a face that still showed the structure of who he had been, he made the decision that this admission was not going to be a 2-week stabilization discharge. He was right. This time the hospital kept him longer. This time a surgeon examined the left arm on the first day and made a recommendation that Dr. Marchenko had been building toward in her notes since October, a recommendation she'd been waiting for Alexei to return to make, because she had known, with the clinical certainty of someone who understands tissue trajectory, that he would return. The recommendation was amputation. The surgery took 2 hours and 40 minutes. Alexei was under general anesthesia for all of it, which meant the event that divided his life into before and after happened without his participation. A clean line drawn while he was absent, the decision made and executed and closed before he was returned to consciousness to discover its results. He woke in a recovery room with a ceiling he didn't recognize, a nurse monitoring equipment beside him, and a specific heaviness on his left side that his brain took several minutes to correctly interpret. Not pain. The nerve block was still active. Weight. The particular weight of a limb ending differently than it had that morning. The surgeon had removed the arm below the elbow. The technical term was transradial amputation, a procedure performed at a point where the tissue was still viable enough to form a functional residual limb above the zone of total destruction that had consumed the forearm. The decision had been made with clinical precision. The wound complex had progressed to the point where the tissue between wrist and mid-forearm was non-viable. The bone at 2 points was showing early osteonecrotic changes, and the infection, despite antibiotic treatment, was continuing to advance proximally toward the elbow. Saving the arm below the elbow was no longer a medical option. Saving the arm above it was the remaining one. When the nerve block wore off, the pain arrived with the thoroughness of something that had been waiting. Post-amputation pain operates on 2 levels simultaneously. The surgical wound itself, which is extensive and raw, and requires its own management, and the phenomenon that neuroscience has documented for 2 centuries without fully explaining, phantom limb pain. The brain, which had spent 24 years mapping the entire arm as part of its body schema, did not immediately accept the revision. It continued sending signals to a forearm that no longer existed, and receiving, in return, a confusion that expressed itself as pain in the absent limb. Specific, localized, sometimes burning, sometimes a crushing pressure, sometimes the precise sensation of the fingers moving through a motion they could no longer perform. Alexei experienced all variants. The medical staff managed it with what they had, which was not sufficient but was what existed. He was 24 years old with one arm, and this was not the worst thing that was currently happening to his body. The jaw osteonecrosis had been assessed during the admission workup, and the imaging results had been reviewed by a maxillofacial surgeon who had used careful clinical language to describe a situation that the images communicated more directly. A section of the right mandible was dead. Not dying. Dead. The bone tissue no longer perfused, no longer remodeling, sitting in his jaw like structural material that had been removed from the system while the housing around it continued. The treatment for mandibular osteonecrosis at this stage involved surgical removal of the dead bone, reconstruction, and an extended recovery period. a process that required a level of stability and systemic health that Alexei did not currently possess and would not possess until the addiction was addressed and his body had months of proper nutrition and care behind it. So the jaw was documented, photographed for the medical record, treated palliatively with antibiotics and pain management, and marked as a future surgical priority. His body had acquired a waiting list of repairs, organised by urgency, and the jaw was behind the arm in the queue. The kidneys were on the list too. Routine blood work from the first day of admission had returned values that the treating physician had circled in red on the printout. Creatinine and urea elevated beyond the normal range in a pattern consistent with chronic kidney damage. The toxic load that Krokodil's impurities had been delivering to Alexei's renal system over 9 months of regular use had produced measurable structural damage to both kidneys. Not failure, not yet, not requiring dialysis, but the kind of damage that, once present, tends to progress rather than resolve, and that placed him on a trajectory toward more serious renal impairment if the source of damage continued. The source of damage continued. Even in the hospital, even in the post-surgical ward with monitoring equipment and nursing staff and a treatment plan, the addiction was present as a biological fact. Withdrawal began within 12 hours of admission, running parallel to post-surgical recovery in a combination that the medical staff managed by addressing each component as best they could with frequently conflicting requirements. Adequate pain management for post-amputation recovery required opioid medication, but opioid medication in a patient with severe opioid dependency required careful calibration to avoid either undertreating surgical pain or inadvertently resupplying the addiction. The treating team navigated this with the particular difficulty of a problem that had no clean solution, only a series of trade-offs. Krokodil withdrawal is documented by survivors and medical staff as substantially worse than heroin withdrawal. The duration is longer, where heroin withdrawal typically peaks at 72 hours and substantially resolves within a week. Krokodil withdrawal extends across weeks, the body's adjustment period protracted by the depth of the chemical restructuring the drug had performed on the nervous system. The symptoms followed the standard opioid withdrawal profile: sweating, nausea, muscle cramps, insomnia, anxiety, but at higher intensity and longer duration, amplified by the neurological damage that the drug's impurities had been accumulating throughout the period of use. Alexei went through it. There is no way to describe this that doesn't collapse into either clinical detachment or melodrama, and neither is accurate. It was weeks of a specific kind of suffering that the human body is capable of producing, not dangerous in the immediately life-threatening way of some withdrawal syndromes, but sustained and consuming and absolutely resistant to any mental reframing that might make it easier. He was sedated for portions of it. He was conscious for enough of it to have a complete and unmediated experience of what his body felt like in the absence of the drug it had reorganized itself around. The bone pain was constant and deep. The insomnia was near total for the first 2 weeks. He slept in fragments of 90 minutes separated by hours of wakefulness, in which the ward's night sounds provided the only company. The hospital had a psychologist on staff, Dr. Irina Volskaya, a woman in her late 30s who held sessions with addiction patients as part of the treatment protocol. She visited Alexei 3 times in the first week, twice in the second, and then weekly after that. She was competent and undramatic, approaching the sessions with a practical focus on immediate coping and near-future planning, rather than the deeper excavation of causation that longer-term therapy might attempt. She understood her constraints. She had limited time per patient, a ward full of people with urgent needs, and a treatment timeline determined by bed availability rather than therapeutic readiness. In her patient notes, filed in his growing medical record, She wrote that he demonstrated adequate cognitive engagement with session material, but showed marked deficit in future orientation, specifically difficulty constructing or maintaining mental representations of himself as a person with a future beyond the immediate term. She did not characterize this as depression, though the symptom overlapped with depressive presentation. She characterized it as accurate assessment, a person whose recent experience had provided consistent evidence that forward planning and actual outcomes bore little relationship to each other, responding to that evidence by contracting his temporal horizon to the manageable present. His mother visited on the third week. She'd been called by the hospital. Alexei had given her name and number as emergency contact during the admission, which was itself a change from the October hospitalization, where he had listed no contact. She arrived on a Tuesday, sat beside his bed, and looked at her son with a particular expression she'd developed over the preceding months. Grief that had moved past its acute phase into something chronic, the emotional equivalent of a wound that has stopped bleeding and started scarring. She looked at his left arm, the residual limb ending at mid-forearm, dressed and wrapped in surgical bandaging. She held his right hand with both of hers and didn't let go for the entire visit. He was the weight of a child. He was 24, and he had the physical profile of someone who'd been through a sustained war, which was not entirely metaphorical, because what Krokodil did to the body was structurally similar to what certain weapons do to bodies, the tissue destruction operating on the same biological mechanisms as chemical burns and blast trauma. His face had the quality of someone who had travelled a very long distance and was not sure what they had arrived at. The facility that received him after the hospital acute phase was a long-term medical rehabilitation centre, not a standard narcology unit, but a facility that handled patients with concurrent serious medical conditions alongside addiction, which placed it in a small category of Russian institutions actually equipped to address what Krokodil produced. He was transferred by ambulance in December, 6 weeks after the November admission, into an environment of greater structure and longer timeline. His room had a window that faced a courtyard. The courtyard had 2 benches and a tree that had lost its leaves and stood against the winter sky in the structural clarity of a deciduous tree in December. All architecture, no disguise, the branching pattern visible in a way it wasn't when the foliage provided covering. He sat in the chair by the window on the first day and looked at the tree for a long time without thinking anything in particular, which was different from the dissociated non-thinking of his worst months in the apartment. This was quieter, more voluntary. The absence of the drug creating, for the first time in 9 months, a silence that was not withdrawal but simply silence. He was 24 years old. He had 1 arm, damaged kidneys, a jaw requiring future surgery, reduced cognitive function, a body that would take years to approach anything resembling its pre-Krokodil baseline, and an addiction that would require sustained management rather than resolution. Because addiction is not a problem that gets solved, only a condition that gets managed, and the quality of management determines the quality of everything that follows. Dr. Volskaya's note in his file, written on the day of his transfer, was 3 sentences. She wrote that he had survived a physical ordeal that the majority of Krokodil users did not survive. She wrote that his prognosis for sustained recovery depended on factors that were not yet determinable. She wrote finally that he showed no interest in the future, and that this was not a clinical failure but an accurate response to the evidence his life had provided so far, and that the therapeutic task, if time and resources permitted, was to provide him with different evidence. Outside, it was December in Yekaterinburg. The snow had arrived and settled and was not going anywhere. Russia's Krokodil epidemic didn't end. It peaked, and then it was legislated into a different shape, and the difference between those 2 things matters enormously. The legislation came in June 2012. That month, the Russian government reclassified codeine-containing medications as prescription only, a change that sounds administrative until you understand that this single regulatory adjustment removed the foundational ingredient from every kitchen laboratory in the country simultaneously. No prescription infrastructure, no supply chain, no synthesis. The epidemic's collapse after June 2012 was nearly as rapid as its expansion had been, which was itself an indictment of the 3 years of inaction that preceded the law, 3 years during which the ingredient that made everything possible was available over the counter at every pharmacy, while the bodies accumulated in hospital wards and municipal cemeteries across the industrial belt of Russia. The numbers, assembled from regional health data and later from independent research, described a scale that the individual stories had only suggested. Estimates of Krokodil users in Russia between 2009 and 2012 range from 100,000 to 300,000, depending on methodology and the researchers' willingness to account for the significant undercounting that stigmatized drug use always produces in official statistics. The average life expectancy after first use was documented at approximately 2 years. The arithmetic of those two figures, applied to each other, produces a number that sits in the mind with considerable weight. The demographic profile was consistent across cities and studies, predominantly male, predominantly between 18 and 30, predominantly from urban industrial areas with high unemployment. This was not coincidence. It was the precise population that post-Soviet economic restructuring had produced in its largest quantity. Young people with technical education and no legitimate application for it, in cities built around industries that no longer needed them, with time and desperation, and a pharmacy on every corner selling codeine without a prescription. The drug didn't create the conditions. The conditions created the demand, and the drug filled it with the efficiency of something specifically designed for the purpose, which it wasn't. It was simply cheap, accessible, and catastrophically destructive, which in the relevant market was sufficient. The medical literature that emerged from the epidemic was unlike anything that had appeared in addiction medicine before. Case reports from Russian hospitals documented wound presentations that attending physicians compared, in their published notes, to combat injuries and industrial chemical exposures. The bone involvement, the osteonecrosis of the jaw and other skeletal sites, appeared in the literature as a distinct clinical entity, studied and named and added to the medical framework for understanding what synthetic impurities do to human tissue over time. The comparison to radium jaw appeared in multiple papers independently, researchers arriving at the same historical parallel without collaboration. Western media had discovered Krokodil in 2011, 2 years after Lena's photographs had begun circulating through journalism networks. The coverage that followed was intense, global, and almost entirely focused on the physical horror, the wounds, the tissue destruction, the visual documentation that made the drug's effects impossible to describe inadequately. Time magazine published photographs. Vice produced video. The Daily Mail ran images that generated significant reader response and editorial discussion about whether publishing them was ethical, a conversation that the people in the photographs were not alive to participate in. The coverage was not wrong. The physical reality it documented was real and important, but it treated the phenomenon as spectacle rather than symptom, focusing on what the drug did to bodies rather than what social conditions had made the drug necessary. This framing would repeat itself 2 years later when reports emerged of Krokodil appearing in the United States, cases in Arizona and Oklahoma in 2013 that generated significant media alarm before subsequent investigation found the evidence less definitive than initial reports had suggested. The American media response demonstrated that the lesson of Krokodil had been absorbed as terrifying drug destroys flesh, rather than economic desperation plus accessible chemistry plus absent policy produces catastrophe. The first lesson produces fear. The second produces change. Fear is easier to generate and less politically costly to act on. Alexei spent 14 months in the rehabilitation facility. He was there through the winter of 2009 into 2010, through the spring and summer and fall of 2010, and into the following winter. The jaw surgery happened in March 2010, a procedure that removed the dead section of mandible and placed a reconstruction that functioned adequately, changed the geometry of his face slightly, and produced a recovery period of 6 weeks during which he ate through a straw and communicated in writing. He approached this with a flat endurance that had become his characteristic mode, not stoic in the dramatic sense, simply depleted of the energy that resistance requires. His cognitive function partially recovered. The brain has a degree of plasticity that the neurotoxicity literature on Krokodil had underestimated in early studies. Some of the white matter damage was permanent, some was functional rather than structural, and the functional damage responded to the sustained absence of chemical insult with gradual, incomplete improvement. His word retrieval improved. The gaps in his memory, the hours lost in the apartment, the vanished days, did not return, because they were gone, but new gaps stopped forming. He regained the ability to track time reliably. He learned the names of the facility staff and retained them from 1 week to the next, which had been impossible in the apartment's final months. He was 25 when he was discharged from the facility, then 26. The years moved differently than they had before, not in the compressed cyclical rhythm of addiction, where time is measured in 90-minute intervals, but in the longer, flatter progression of a life being rebuilt from inadequate materials. He lived with his mother initially, in the apartment where he'd grown up, in a bedroom that had belonged to him as a child, and now contained a man who bore his name and his face, and almost none of his previous continuity of self. The phantom limb pain persisted for 2 years before partially resolving. He learned to manage the residual limb with the practical focus that physical necessity demands, dressing himself, cooking, navigating a world built for two-handed people with one hand, and the adaptations that occupational therapy had provided. He was not graceful about it initially. He became competent over time, which is how most things work when the alternative is not becoming competent. The kidneys stabilized at a reduced function level that required monitoring but not intervention. His nephrologist, a quiet man who delivered information without flourish, told him that sustained abstinence from the drug would likely prevent further deterioration and might allow modest recovery. He used the word might with the careful emphasis of a person who has learned to distinguish between what medicine knows and what medicine hopes. Alexei appreciated the precision. He had been told things with false confidence before. He did not relapse in the first year. He did not relapse in the second year. This is not a triumphant statement. It is a factual one, offered without the narrative arc that recovery stories are conventionally expected to provide. There was no moment of clarity, no single decision point, no transformative event that divided using from not using. There was simply the accumulation of days during which he did not use, each day requiring its own navigation, none of them easy, all of them eventually behind him. He thought about Dmitri sometimes, less about Lena, which surprised him when he noticed it. Not because he cared less, but because thinking about Lena activated something that thinking about Dmitri didn't, a specific quality of loss that sat in a different location and was harder to approach. He had attended Dmitri's funeral. He had not attended Lena's. There had been no funeral he knew of, or if there was, no one had told him. She had entered and exited his life through the same door which was the apartment, and outside that context she had no presence in his world. He knew her name, he knew her age, he knew the texture of her attention, the way she dressed wounds, the nursing textbook she never opened. He knew almost nothing else about who she'd been before she appeared in his kitchen, and this ignorance felt like an additional failure added to a list that was already long. The codeine prescription law passed in June 2012. Alexei was 26, living in his mother's apartment, attending an outpatient support group twice a week, working occasional shifts at a warehouse that a social worker had helped him access. He read about the law in a newspaper, an actual newspaper, physical, something he had started buying partly for the discipline of the daily routine it represented. The article was short. The policy change was described in administrative language, the kind of language that successfully removes human content from decisions that are entirely about human content. He read it twice. Then he folded the newspaper and put it on the table and sat with his one hand flat on the surface, feeling the table's solidity, the specific texture of a thing that exists and holds weight. He thought about the pharmacy 3 blocks from the apartment, where he had bought codeine tablets for 9 months without a prescription, without a question asked, on a routine that the pharmacist must have recognized within weeks. He thought about the matches. He thought about the water bottle of paint thinner that Dmitri had carried through the door one morning in a paper bag, the beginning of everything that followed, presented as casually as an offering of cigarettes. He thought, 3 years. The law could have passed 3 years earlier. He didn't pursue that thought to its conclusion. Some arithmetic is accurate and useless simultaneously, and the skill of distinguishing which conclusions are worth reaching, and which ones only produce damage without information, is one of the things that the years in the facility had given him, imperfectly and incompletely, but enough. By 2013, the Krokodil epidemic in Russia had effectively ended as a mass phenomenon. The pharmacies no longer supplied the foundation ingredient. The kitchens went cold. The specific geography of disaster that had run through Chelyabinsk and Novosibirsk and Perm and Yekaterinburg and a dozen other industrial cities contracted and closed, leaving behind its dead and its survivors and its medical literature and its policy lessons, and the specific, unresolvable question of what might have been different if the response had come sooner. The dead stayed dead. Dmitri Savin, 26, cardiac failure. Lena Sorokina, 21, sepsis. And the others, the thousands of others who had no names in this story but had names, had apartments, had mothers who called phones that didn't answer, had futures that the drug and the conditions that created the drug had consumed. The Russian government never produced an official count. The number that researchers arrived at through indirect methods, excess mortality statistics, hospital records, regional health data, was large enough that presenting it as a single figure feels reductive, the way all large numbers of dead people eventually feel reductive, the individual weight of each loss incompatible with the scale at which it has to be discussed to be politically legible. What remained was this: a winter courtyard in a city in the Urals, and a man sitting on a bench in it, watching snow fall on pavement that had been falling on pavement in this city for every winter of his life. 27 years old. Left sleeve pinned up neatly, the fold precise, the kind of precise that comes from doing something enough times that it becomes automatic. His face showing the specific configuration of a person who has been through a particular kind of weather and come out the other side into whatever this is. Not recovery in the narrative sense, not resolution, not the closed arc of a story that knows where it ends. He watched the snow. It fell on the bench across from him, on the leafless tree at the courtyard's edge, on the building's concrete walls and the path between the buildings and the city beyond the walls that was going about its winter business without awareness of the courtyard or the man in it. The city had already forgotten what had happened here. Not maliciously, the way cities forget things by continuing, by building new events on top of old ones until the old ones are load-bearing structure rather than visible surface. The apartments where the kitchens had run were still apartments, occupied by people who may or may not have known their history. The pharmacies were still pharmacies, now requiring prescriptions for codeine, the policy change having been absorbed into routine so completely that the reason for it was no longer part of the daily transaction. The snow kept falling. Alexei watched it with the particular attention of someone who has recently reacquired the capacity to find a thing sufficient, not meaningful, not redemptive, simply sufficient. Snow falling. A courtyard. A man on a bench with one arm and damaged kidneys and a jaw reconstructed from materials that weren't the original ones. In a city that ran on the memory of industry, in a country that had let a generation dissolve in kitchen chemicals before finding the political will to change a pharmacy policy. He was alive. This was not a small fact, even if it didn't feel large. It was the foundational fact on which whatever came next would be built. Inadequately, imperfectly, with the materials available the way everything is built. The snow kept falling. He didn't move. There was nowhere he needed to be for another hour, and the courtyard was enough, and the snow was enough, and being the person sitting in it instead of the person who didn't make it to this bench, that too was enough. For now.